From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
A new vending machine supporters hope will be the best weapon available in the fight to end the fentanyl poisoning crisis. Plus, a busy week as lawmakers rush to make the first big deadline of the 2024 session. What survived and what didn't? But first, more support for Medicaid expansion, this time from Republicans? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Thanks for joining us. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. A new poll released this week shows Medicaid expansion is popular with Kansas Republican voters, too, despite party leadership's opposition. But what does this new study show us? The first thing to know about this is who did the polling. Public Opinion Strategies. Now, this is a company that does primarily polling for Republican candidates, including Kansas Senators Jerry Moran and Roger Marshall, as well as former Attorney General Derek Schmidt. Why does that matter? Because the poll showed 68% of registered voters, 51% of likely Republican primary voters, and 83% of small business owners all favored expanding Medicaid in Kansas. If approved, a new report this week from the Kansas Health Institute predicts 152,000 Kansans would enroll in the first year, with no additional cost to the state. The Sunflower Foundation, which commissioned the poll, shared support statements from leading voices in the state's business, oil and gas, and agricultural industries, like Jason Cox, president of a Wichita-based aerospace parts manufacturing company and chair of the Wichita Chamber of Commerce. Political analysts say Medicaid expansion would likely pass both the Kansas House and Senate if lawmakers just got the chance to vote on it.
That is likely not going to happen in the current legislature because the leadership in the state House and state Senate is opposed to putting Medicaid expansion up for a vote.
In a written statement, Speaker of the Kansas House Dan Hawkins called the poll misleading, leaving out details about the cost of expansion, saying in part, "Unfortunately, in the real world, these programs have the potential to bankrupt our state budget and drive taxes higher while failing to live up to any of the promises made." Senate President Ty Masterson added in his statement that flooding the fixed Medicaid market with able-bodied adults and putting them ahead of the truly needy that the program was intended for is a bad idea. And here to take on this and other topics today, we have guest panelist Phil Journey, former Republican state senator, Adam Strunk, managing editor of the Harvey County Now, and Angela Smith, regional director at the Kansas Association of Black Journalists. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I think the first question a lot of folks ask is, does this poll really make a difference? The numbers are not drastically different from what we've seen over the last few years from the Kansas Speak survey.
I think that we've been hearing about Medicaid expansion for so long, and we know that the public is for it, but it doesn't look like it's coming up in the legislature. At least not now, not anytime soon. We know that the governor supports it, but right now it doesn't look like Republican leadership does. So I think we kind of know how that stands, but we'll see.
And yet it doesn't seem to hurt Republicans at the polls.
Well, it also you have to look at how the primary system is structured, right? Like, if you have counties that don't have a Democratic Party running, you have a primary, you have people who go out for the primary votes. Those are often your people who are most passionate about certain issues. And so you have a situation where a lot of candidates who are more right of maybe where the general public is being elected.
Yeah.
I think one thing to look at is that it has been consistent with Kansas Speaks polling over the last decade or so. But the small sample size, particularly on the sample for the business owners, was plus or minus 10%. The sample was less than 120 or 125 participants. So, that's just teeny tiny. And I don't know how they selected their samples. But the reality is that they don't have to run this through the legislature. Laura Kelly just has to order it. If you read the federal act carefully, it can either be done by legislative act or by an executive branch. And so I don't see what she's got to lose to give that a try. Alaska did it that way, and the legislature lost their lawsuit trying to undo what the governor had done there. So I think there is real concerns. When I looked at Alaska and researched that a bit, there's real concerns of cost overruns and the system not working as predicted, and it could blow out the budget. It does have that potential. It has to be managed very carefully.
And yeah, I mean, if we look at the states that have done it, there are some states that have had some issues, but most states in general, once they have it in place, the public has said and the legislature has said, don't get rid of it.
One thing I think we need to note too is if you call it Obamacare, the numbers flip.
Yeah.
If you call it CanCare, people are in support of it. And it's an article of faith in the conservative side of the Republican Party.
Yeah. And that is a point that Dr. Allen had brought up when I talked to him. Thank you to him for making a couple of minutes for me at the last minute there. You noticed he was in his car because he was from between one appointment and another. But he did make that point that numbers would be very different if they said Obamacare versus CanCare versus Medicaid expansion, which just goes to show that this is really a political issue, not a public health issue.
Well, yeah, it's politics, but I mean, and it's politics and it's marketing, but I mean, it's also education too, because like it's not a simple issue to discuss. Like, you know, you have numbers like 152,000 will get care. Well, what kind of care? Well, who qualifies? Well, who? You know what I mean? Like, if you'd ask a regular voter, it's really hard for someone to like explain to the T what this would do. It's hard for me as a journalist to explain to the T what this is going to do without doing a lot of research and writing about it. So, I mean, of course, like names play a role.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the semantics are everything, talking the different names of it. But I think at the end of the day, for most people, at least that we've talked to, especially healthcare providers, especially in rural America, that they say that they would approve of Medicaid expansion. So I would say that if the legislators were listening to those demographics, then they probably would maybe take a deeper dive. But again, it comes down to the politics of it all.
And again, many legislators are. It just has to get to the floor to a vote.
No. All right. Well, and we do know, we've seen it happen occasionally. Legislators can overrule leadership if they're willing to take that risk.
And get kicked off all their committees and be blacklisted. And yeah, and this certain leadership has, you know, been pretty aggressive in going after people who don't go along with their agenda.
That is true. That is true. Well, you may have noticed the lack of sitting lawmakers on this panel, and that's because they were still haggling over bills at the State House as we were recording the episode. This Friday is what's called Turnaround Day, when bills, with only a handful of exceptions, have to make it halfway to the governor's desk or die for the year. Lawmakers waded through a mountain of bills this last week as they closed in on the halfway mark of the session. Here's a look at some of the topics they covered. A pair of bills born in the fury over COVID restrictions, including a patient's Bill of Rights that ensures the ability to have your loved ones at your side when you die, and a bill that would limit the KDHE secretary's ability to make recommendations about contagious diseases and how to prevent the spread of infectious disease. A Wichita lawmaker made a Hail Mary attempt to get marijuana legalized in Kansas by asking to have it removed from the state's controlled substances list. It sparked a heated debate between supporters of legalization and those who say the House has done its part and they need to let the Senate work on the issue now. The effort ultimately failed. Another failure, the attempt to overrule the governor on a flat tax plan. Republicans tried to override her veto on a tax plan that included a 5.25% flat tax, but came up 3 votes short after some Republicans defected. Lawmakers still have half the session to come up with a new tax plan. But after several years of trying, lawmakers did manage to get a Good Samaritan drug bill past the Kansas House. Kansas is just one of 2 states at this point not to have a Good Samaritan law that protects citizens from prosecution for drug possession if they call for help when someone is overdosing. Stay with that person until emergency personnel arrive and cooperate completely with law enforcement and EMS. It's an idea supporters say could help put the brakes on the growing fentanyl poisoning crisis in Kansas. Of course, that's just a taste of the dozens of bills they've been debating this week. I'm going to put it out there. What other issues do you think were big deals that came up before the House and Senate this week?
Well, I think one was the marijuana one, and the reality is that while there's a lot of public support for it, I haven't seen a bill that really does a good job for it. About, 5-7 years ago, I went to a judge's thing in Denver about legalization, like what the courts were doing about it. And they had the chief of the Department of Revenue for states like Washington and whatever, and they're all explaining how they have their system set up. And I haven't seen a bill in Kansas yet that really is a comprehensive one that would help promote public safety with this. We already have products in the market today legal under Kansas like K-Trom that people can overdose and die from. And so, I really think they need to go back to the drawing boards and do it well. For example, there's a big ag component for the growers because you got to make sure they don't spray the wrong pesticide on it or the wrong herbicide on it and kill people. So, it's so much more than just, let's just sell some dope and make some money, for the legislature, and they really need to get to it. I think that this issue is dead for the session. I think the tax is the biggest session because they just missed the override on the governor, so they're going to go back and they're going to do their thing. The reality is too that there are some bills are exempt from turnaround if they're filed in Ways and Means or other exempt committees. So there's still lots for them to do besides what the other chamber got done.
Yeah, and of course, they can also, a committee chair can request a bill be blessed by leadership, which means even though it's not naturally considered still alive, leadership can say, you can keep working on it. And we won't know for a week or so yet which bills have been blessed per se. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah. And I think it's important to not conflate recreational marijuana laws with medical. Like, this isn't just maybe the state selling dope. This is maybe the state allowing people dying of cancer to get medical marijuana. There's a lot of competing laws out there. But both recreational and medical have support from Kansas polling.
No.
On that topic, something I haven't seen covered a whole lot, but it cleared the House with bipartisan support, and I think there's a similar bill that made it through the Senate, is reforming forfeiture laws.
Yes, that was a big deal. We actually talked about that on the show last week, but
sorry.
That's okay. But and we actually had one of the folks who was on the House committee when they were hearing that bill give a very good description. So if you want more details about what civil asset forfeiture is, you don't know what that is previously, go check out that episode. But definitely a big issue where we have accusations that police departments are basically funding themselves by taking money from so-called suspects who are never charged.
Yeah, and that's kind of the strong argument against it. It rankles because it goes through a civil court process, and so you can have a situation to where they file a suit against the money. And if the money they can prove is it's not a reasonable doubt. I don't want to get far into it, but yeah, you could have situations where you were never convicted of a crime, but you still had your property taken by the government to fund the government, and I think that's kind of goes against a lot of how people view America should operate.
Kind of sounds like it goes against the U.S. Constitution to me, but I'm not the lawyer in the room.
Yeah, Phil.
What? Oh, well, there have been horror stories of people on the way to closing for their house, and they're going to pay for it with cash, and they get pulled over, and they go, "Why do you got $75,000 cash on you?" And guess what? Closing doesn't go forward. The cop takes the money, and then everything falls apart. So there is some abuse out there. It's not unusual for law enforcement to benefit from it because that's the way the thing's set up. If they're out there running I-70 and they're catching them going from Denver to Missouri, that's what they got. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to the fact that, like you said, people who are not doing the wrong thing are the ones that's getting caught up in this issue, and so
it's rare, but it does happen.
It does happen,
sure.
Yeah.
And I think it happens in some cases a lot more than others, depending on the law enforcement.
Exactly.
Americans for Prosperity did a study on this about a year or so ago, and the percentages that they came up with, and I can't remember them off the top of my head right now, but they were very eye-opening as far as the number of folks who were never charged but had their property taken. Yeah. Well, speaking of the fentanyl crisis, that was one of the things lawmakers have been talking about this week. Here in Wichita, local leaders are working to fight back as well, opening several naloxone vending machines. Kick's Abby Ray explains.
Wichita is disproportionately affected by the opioid problem, and we want to get these machines in the communities where they will do the most good.
Wichita got one of the first naloxone vending machines in the state Thursday. Naloxone is a medicine that rapidly an opiate overdose, and it comes in kits that make it easy to administer. These vending machines are extremely easy to use.
That's completely anonymous. All you need to do is put in the zip code, and it'll dispense one of these kits, and you too could potentially have a life-saving treatment in your home.
These machines are stocked with 190 nasal Narcan kits to combat the opioid crisis. And organizers say they plan on restocking it monthly at least.
I hope this really raises awareness about how easy it is to save someone from an overdose, and I hope it also reduces stigma in the community Oftentimes there is a lot of stigma associated with substance misuse, and so I hope this helps educate folks about the importance of helping others and saving lives in our state.
Healthy Blue Kansas partnered with DECA to fund this machine and its purpose. It's located in downtown Wichita to target those that need it most. It was placed here just a week ago, and organizers say it's already been used more than 100 times.
I've definitely lost people. I wish I would have had Narcan on site at that point, but now I'm just really grateful that I carried it as well. So you never want to have to use it, but in the event that, we may need it, that could save somebody's life.
For those concerned this vending machine could bring in new crime to the area,
there's a certain amount of purity and honor that comes along with this population of people as well that I don't believe that we're going to see our machine vandalized. We haven't seen that yet. Our building isn't really vandalized either. So I think that if anything, people in this neighborhood respect the fact that we're offering this.
Even the director of the KBI is pushing these Narcan kits, saying this is one of the best things that we have to fight the fentanyl crisis. I spoke with him a couple weeks ago back, well, longer than that, it was the beginning of the session, but he was talking about how one of his own agents had to use the Narcan to save his life because he had just come from a bust an undercover operation, and had unknowingly been exposed. He was too far away from his backup for them to get to him in time. The only option he had, but because the agents carry Narcan on them, he was able to use it and stop the overdose then. But that's how insidious this is. You don't have to be a user to come in contact with it.
Right. I've had 3-year-olds test positive for meth. Oh. So in my court cases, one thing to keep in mind too is the bill that they used, they tried to amend for the marijuana. What the bill originally was doing was updating our schedule to match the federal schedule of illegal drugs, and they added 23 variants of fentanyl. And so each one of these variants chemically have to be described with particularity in the statute, and some of them are even 10 or 20 times more powerful than fentanyl, which is 10 or 20 times more powerful than heroin. And so an absolutely microscopic amount can kill you.
Yeah. And we've been reporting on this, I'm sure you have as well, for a few years now, just how widespread and deadly this is.
Well, and it's for people who are using drugs that aren't necessarily opioids or heroin. Like, it gets cut in a lot of different things where you're seeing a lot of random overdoses in people who weren't traditionally overdosing, because, people who use, they kind of know how much to use, and then you just have that happen just because it's mixed in. I think this is good policy because I don't think anyone thinks drug use should be a death sentence.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's available to those who need it in the case that they are using something that they don't know what it is. And then I just know outside of even the vending machines, I think the availability of Narcan and naloxone is big, because I know parents who have it because unfortunately, it's in the hands of the children or somebody maybe in their school or somebody that they know or that they've met, and so they have it on hand just in case.
And locally, I am seeing a lot of grass work by either health organizations, by law enforcement, by different community groups to hold these Narcan education sessions, to provide free Narcan, to make sure community members know that it is available and get it into people's hands.
And the important thing, as the KBI director pointed out when I was talking with him, is having it on you. Right. It's not something you can buy and just leave in your medicine cupboard. You've got to carry it with you because you never know.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, wildfire danger remains a serious and growing concern in parts of Kansas. KSN's Adam Larduna shows us how crews are prepping for potentially busy season.
Strong winds and dry conditions have fire crews in southwest Kansas on alert.
So we just got to be cautious and keep an eye on the weather.
The Seward County Fire Chief says they're geared up for the season, making sure equipment is ready.
The smallest wind and the driest conditions can really take off on us. So, our goal as a fire department is we try to get on it fast and get on it quickly.
The Kansas Forest Service says 95% of the wildfires in Kansas are started by humans, by things like controlled burns that get out of control or machinery work in fields or nearby dry grasses.
Those of us who work outdoors have to be very cognizant of anything that we're doing that creates an open flame or a spark. Whether that's welding on a fence or burning trash or even a prescribed fire.
Across the state, many communities rely on volunteer firefighters and their neighbors to fight big fires.
There's not a lot of resources out there if you compare Kansas to Colorado or Oregon or California with what the state does for their wildland resources. Kansas has been mostly reliant on their volunteer firefighters.
And Adam, you were nodding along for major portions of that story. I know that large sections of your coverage area really deal with these wildfire problems.
The northwest corner of the county out by Burton, I mean, it seems we have one every like 2 or 3 years. And I mean, it is a big issue. And as these, again, whatever you want to say, become more common, like it's not just a localized issue, right? Like you have Burton, they've got a relatively small fire district. Well, they have to have a number of firefighters respond to this, but you can't, even as a taxing authority, support enough firefighters to respond to this. So then Newton has to come, Halstead has to come, all these surrounding communities, and then your county has to put more money towards hiring or helping these communities hire firefighters. And so you see this tax kind of requirement on funding going after these fires kind of expand. So it isn't as much of a localized issue as people think, and I can imagine the state eventually putting more money into its forestry service to have to go after this. So this is an issue that affects more people than you would think.
Yeah, and we know that they have put a lot of money over the last decade into the Forestry Service, and working also with the National Guard. They've got that new helicopter that they can drop, the tanker with a bucket that can pick up water from any pond anywhere and drop it.
And it's also a land management issue too. I mean, if we watched the B-roll over there, it was red cedar after red cedar after red cedar after red cedar. Like, and again, I'm not saying like everyone needs to be out cutting red cedars off of their property because those things propagate. No, it's a ton of work. I don't like cutting red cedars. I've cut plenty of them. But I will say that like that is a really interesting and important component, and maybe there's some other policies or best practices we could influence to try to cut down on that risk.
The truth is the red cedar is an invasive species, and it uses far more water than
40 gallons a tree
trees.
a day. Yeah, it's a mess.
So what we're really facing with the amplitude of climate change increasing is reduced moisture content in the soil because it doesn't freeze anymore.
Yeah.
The wind blows and it just evaporates out of the dirt. And that's why we really have some really poor wheat harvests too, because it doesn't go dormant and it shrivels up and dies in the winter.
Yeah, and this has certainly been a dry February. We haven't had much in the way of
rain.
rain.
And a warm one. It's supposed to be like 80 Monday the last time I looked.
It will be 80.
Yeah.
Well, I know another big thing is the
This
volunteer
is your weather.
firefighters is that what we've heard about. They're aging out, so the departments don't have the number of people that they used to help and fight those fires.
Yeah.
So again, they're using some of those task force to help come in and have to put those fires out. And of course, like we said, the mitigation, people who live out on some of these rural properties, making sure that they're watering their grass because it's been dry, and making sure that you know those cedars, if they have to cut them down.
You know, if you're in Dodge City or out west, the Ogallala, you may not be able to water your lawn in just a few years.
That's true.
And that's a huge issue.
It makes me think that Mike Hayden was right all along, and we're going to go to Buffalo Commons.
It's possible. They used to call it the Great American Desert. There was a reason for that.
Yep.
Well, finally today, Sedgwick County says there are more than 700 people who are homeless in just the Wichita area. As the population of the unhoused continues to grow, city leaders are discussing ways to bring those numbers down. KAKE's Nick Nelson takes a look.
Members of the Wichita community met Wednesday night at the Advanced Learning Library to discuss Wichita's growing rate of people living on the streets. City Council member J.V. Johnston, who's been working on the city's homeless task force, says it's the goal of the city to achieve functional zero homelessness, meaning there are more people coming out of living on the streets than going in.
I think if we all work hard and all the agencies collaborate, work together, city and county and the nonprofits all work together, including the business community, we can achieve it.
Sedgwick County's ComCare program says a recent count shows 702 homeless people in the area.
One of the easiest answers, right, are facilities where we can provide wraparound services and we can provide a housing first approach, right? The data is out there, the information is out there. I encourage you to go out and understand better those two philosophies.
However, some at the town hall expressed concern about Wichita spending money on different services to help and outside studies, and spoke in favor of keeping the money in Wichita to directly benefit the unhoused.
It's passing the buck in a giant circle. If you want results, you have to have accountability, and you cannot have accountability if you diffuse it into a zillion entities.
And one thing in Wichita that they've talked about a lot is developing a campus, a single location where all of these services and aid are under one roof and one location to help folks out. It's based off of a system in San Antonio that's been wildly successful, but it feels like we've been talking about it for years and it hasn't happened yet.
I think that's the big issue, is that it's meeting after meeting after meeting, kind of like what happened to our temporary shelter. And then there was a decision made that not everybody was happy about. No. So I think we'll probably, hopefully, continue to meet to find a solution to this area, but we'll see.
Well, and it's also a situation where, like, you have larger cities like Wichita or Newton, who offers quite a few services. They don't just carry the load for Wichita or Newton. You have all of these other rural areas or small areas that aren't equipped, where we hear reports of busing over, moving over, dumping over. And I mean, you would hope that people wouldn't handle people that way, but that's often kind of what we see. And then you have communities that are left, you know, trying to carry the load. And the other deal is, like, when we say you don't see a whole lot of stuff happening, that's because usually these conversations are people who motivated by people who don't want to see the homeless around. Whenever that becomes an issue in the town, it's because I have to see them and I don't want to see them. And we have this habit of, like, trying to disappear people in society that we just don't feel comfortable around. And so then you have these conversations where, let's build a homeless shelter on the outside of town. I covered a community that did that, and that didn't make a whole lot of sense because all the services were in the middle of the town. Right. And so that was a number of years ago. But yeah, and so it's just like trying to get everyone to talk about these people, but also to talk about it in an empathetic way that views them as our neighbors and our people around them, instead of just a problem that makes us uncomfortable that we just don't want to see.
And it's a problem that's not going away, at least not with the way the economy's been.
No. All you got to do is drive downtown at 5 o'clock and see what's going on. The reality is that those are all worthy goals that the city councilman has stated, but the implementation is incredibly complicated because you've got to coordinate various government entities, and if someone really doesn't want to play ball, nothing happens. And it just keeps getting tabled, or they keep coming up with another excuse. It's a lot like the legislature.
Look at that. Government is like government. And you know, it's complicated because the causes are complicated.
Yeah, it's not one cause. There's not a magic bullet that if we just fix this, we'd fix that.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for today. Thank you all so much for joining me, Adam, Angela, and Phil. I appreciate it. I'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, KSN News, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to continue the discussion with you on social media. Just look for PBS Kansas or Pilar Pedraza TV on most platforms. For now, stay safe and have a great week.